Good evening, family. Um, this evening we're going to be in Daniel chapter 3 if you got your Bibles. So I invite you to turn there and follow along with us. Real quick question. Is anyone here using the King James? Has anyone got the King James in front of them? No? You do? All right, awesome. I might call on you to read a couple verses. Um, you'll understand when we get there why I say that. But Daniel chapter 3 is kind of the golden chapter of Daniel. It's the one everybody knows, even kids after Sunday school know about Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego in the furnace. Um, really, the main idea that we're looking at in Daniel chapter 3 is this idea of trusting in God regardless of what he chooses. Right? And there's going to be a point where the gentleman talk to Nebuchadnezzar and say something that I really want you guys to pay attention to when we get there, because it really does sum up the entirety of why this chapter exists. So, with that in mind, let's get started. Verse 1 of chapter 3, and we don't really have a good idea of how much time is in between chapter 2 and chapter 3. So, this could be just a short little while, couple months, couple years, or it could be a decent bit of time in between this vision that Nebuchadnezzar has in chapter 2 and the monument he erects in chapter 3. Nebuchadnezzar the king made an image of gold, the height of which was 60 cubits and its width 6 cubits. He set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. Then Nebuchadnezzar the king sent word to assemble the satraps, the prefects, and the governors, and the counselors, the treasurers, the judges, the magistrates, and all the rulers of the provinces to come to the dedication of the image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. Then the satraps, the prefects, the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the judges, the magistrates, and all of the rulers of the province were assembled for the dedication of the image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up, and they stood before the image that Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Then the herald loudly proclaimed to you, the command is given, O peoples, nations, and men of every language, that at the moment you hear the sound of the horn, flute, lyre, trigon, psaltery, bagpipe, and all kinds of music, you are to fall down and worship the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar the king has set up. So there's a lot of wordiness here, and there's a lot of repetition. But the main idea is that this is actually a test of loyalty for Nebuchadnezzar. Now, I want us to understand that, because it's going to color what 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 it means when people refuse to obey. This isn't simply he's setting up a new religion, but instead this is actually a test to see how many of his rulers, how many of his subjects are loyal to his decrees. Verse 6, but whoever does not fall down and worship shall immediately be cast into the midst of a furnace of blazing fire. Therefore, at that time, when all the peoples heard the sound of the horn, flute, lyre, trigon, psaltery, bagpipe, and all kinds of music, all the peoples, nations, and men of every language fell down and worshipped the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. For this reason, at that time, certain Chaldeans came forward and brought charges against the Jews. They responded and said to Nebuchadnezzar the king, O king, live forever. You yourself, O king, have made a decree that every man who hears the sound of the horn, flute, lyre, trigon, psaltery, and bagpipe, and all kinds of music, is to fall down and worship the golden image. But whoever does not fall down and worship shall be cast into the midst of a furnace of blazing fire. There are certain Jews whom you have appointed over the administration of the province of Babylon, namely Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men, O king, have disregarded you. They do not serve your gods and worship the golden image which you have set up. I want to ask a question, and you can answer it if you want to, or you can treat it as a rhetorical question, something for you to think about later. Has at any point in your life, somebody who had authority over you told you that if you did not do something that you, or if you did something that you knew God wanted you to do, if you did this thing, you might die? Does that ever happen in your life? Because I can think of something not so distant in the past where that exact same thing happened. Wasn't that the threat? A year ago, we were told that. If you guys assemble and worship together and sing songs of hymns to one another, you might catch COVID and die. How did you respond to that? This isn't a time for me to attack your views or suggest that you were somehow wrong in response, but instead I just want you to consider that in light of the story that we're reading today. This is a difficult concept, I think, because we constantly have to ask ourselves, whose authority do we obey? Do we obey God's or do we obey man's? Now, the reason this becomes difficult is because God's commandments dictate that we follow the government's orders. But there comes a time when the two are at odds. When the laws of man no longer line up with the laws of God. And it is in those moments that we find ourselves in the position of these three young men and have to decide which one is the most important to us. I'm a big fan of telling all people when considering the idea of coming to Christ, when considering the idea of becoming a Christian, that one of the most important things that must be done is that you count the cost. We say it in regards to those who have sacrificed in the military all the time, right? Freedom isn't free. Grace freely given is not freely accepted. It costs us something to put on Christ. The idea of repentance is a very serious thing. And so it has to weigh heavily on us. Anytime we think that something that we're about to do or something that we're told to do is in contradiction to God's word, we have to let that weigh heavy on us. And for these men, we're going to see how they responded, and I think that we'll find some liberty in how they approach this. Verse 12, or sorry, I went way back. Verse 14, Nebuchadnezzar responded and said to them, "Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the golden image that I have set up? Now, if you are ready, at the moment you hear the sound of the horn, flute, lyre, trigon, psaltery, and bagpipe, and all kinds of music, to fall down and worship the image that I have made, very well. But if you will not worship, you will immediately be cast into the midst of a furnace of blazing fire. And what God is there who can deliver you out of my hands?" Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, "O Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to give you an answer concerning this matter." I want to stop right there, and could you guys read verse 16 out of the King James for us? Thank you. I want you guys to, very briefly, I want you guys to keep in mind the wording of the King James here, because we're going to make a point of difference on how it's worded. Verse 17, "If it be so, our God, whom we serve, is able to deliver us from the furnace of blazing fire, and he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. But even if he does not, let it be known to you O king, that we are not going to serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up. This is a little bit of a struggle for me at first, because it didn't seem right. The idea that they told him, we don't need to answer you, but here's our answer. And I found some revelation when I looked at the King James Version, because the way that's worded is, it gives us a much different idea. Because their response was, we do not need to be careful about how we answer you. Well, that's a whole different meaning. And there's some impact there. What kind of excuses do we give ourselves for not doing the right thing? Do we minimize it? Right? That's one approach. Well, it's not that big of a deal, and God can forgive me later. We can dismiss it and argue, well, I can think of 1,001 reasons why God wasn't directly meaning this specific situation, why this isn't a sin this time. We can project, right? Well, who are you to tell me this is a sin when you're doing this, this, and this? We can deflect or excuse. Well, I know that this isn't necessarily right, but I have to do this in order to do this other thing that is good. I think we as creatures of imagination and ingenuity, which is really a beautiful thing that God has given us, can often work against us. We are masters at figuring out why what is good is bad and why what is bad is good. I mean, I have met people that can argue anything and make it sound like a good idea. And if sometimes we find ourselves in a position where if we give ourselves too much time, we allow those whisperings to enter in, right? And we're looking at a situation in front of us. We're deciding what we should be doing right here and now. And sometimes if we hesitate, if we are too careful to answer, we find ourselves coming up with all kinds of myriads of excuses to allow ourselves to step down from righteousness. The most common one I think that I've ever heard is, God will forgive me later. But I think there's a certain aspect of that has enough validity that it's worth looking at. Because God tells us he'll forgive us. His grace knows no bounds. And don't ever let anyone take that from you. It's the foundation of our entire relationship with our Creator. But God's grace to us is a reason for obedience, not a license for rebellion. Kindness and love is not a reason for you to be angry and hateful. Do you understand how the two just don't match? That doesn't make sense. Somebody forgiving you cannot be an excuse to damage your relationship with that person again. Dave, you look confused about something I just said. Am I not explaining it right? Okay. Does everyone understand what I'm saying with that point? The idea of grace is not to be minimized or undermined. But there's no such thing as an indulgence card. Just because God forgives you for your sins does not give you the freedom to continue making sin. Right. And their argument there was even more profound than the one I just gave, right? Because their argument was, well, if those who sin much are forgiven much, we should continue sinning because then we'll be forgiven more. The logic may seem sound, but it doesn't take long to figure out why that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So there are, and don't get me wrong, when we have a response to make, we should be considerate of how we respond. We're not to lash out in anger. We're not to word things in such a way that they would be a hindrance to somebody else. We have to be careful to be respectful to one another, to be loving to one another, even when we're rebuking or correcting. But there are times when being too cautious to give an answer does you no good, but instead will only offer you an opportunity to back down. When you know the answer, you know the answer. And there's no reason to continue delaying giving it. I want to bring our attention to the mentality of Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego in their response. You see something really cool in how they talk to Nebuchadnezzar. They're firm, right? They don't give flowery words to hide their intention. They said, "Even if he does not, let it be known to you, O king, that we are not going to serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up." They don't make it confusing. They don't try to make it easier for him to accept. They state in no uncertain terms, this is where we stand. Go ahead. Yeah. Absolutely. I think that we're looking at a trial here, right? And if you look at what we've seen just in 3 short chapters, it really seems that they can act right in this situation because they had practice in lesser situations. Right? You look back at chapter 1, right, when they're tempted with food and luxury, that wouldn't have been a big deal to give into, right? No one's dying. But because they could stand right in those situations, it made it easier when it's a bigger situation, which brings up a good point, Dave, because I think sometimes we give ourselves the excuse that this is small. When it's important, I'll stand for God. You know, when somebody speaks blasphemy, I'll stand for God. But this situation I'm in, this isn't a big deal. But here's the thing: if you can't stand it's completely backwards from how it should work. Because here's the thing: if you can't stand for God in the small situations when there's no risk, how do you think you're going to stand for God when there's a risk? If you can't stand for God when your comfort is on the line, don't make the mistake of thinking you're going to be capable of standing for God when your life is on the line. That's not how things work. So I think you're right, Dave. I think that they made the decision that they were going to do what is right no matter the cost a long time ago. But what we see here is this wonderful situation where they have lived their life in accordance with that decision, and it's allowed them to stick by it no matter how great the cost gets. As to how they're speaking to the king, we also notice something else. Even though they're not, so I'm trying to figure out the right phrase because the phrase that I would normally use is not quite right. They're not beating around the bush about where they stand on this, but yet they're being respectful. We don't see hateful language from them. We don't see anger. We don't see outrage. It's just, we're not going to do this. I have this notion in my head that I kind of has been sticking with me since studying through Daniel chapter 3, in that so often when we look at talking to people about God and instructing people about God, we want it to be this big thing, right? We want the church to put on an event and gather 1,000 people in one area, and we can talk to them all. And it's going to be this big, glorious, momentous occasion. But oftentimes, it's the quiet submission that ripples the loudest. It's that one-on-one time. It's that time you spend with a good friend where you just give him a wholesome relationship. It's that time that you just simply helped somebody out and didn't expect anything from them. These are the moments that actually stick with people. It's the things that change people's lives. Most often, it's not some big event. I was talking to the elders last night, and I brought this up to Dave, and coincidentally, it works because he didn't actually remember it. But I had talked to him about what caused me to go down this path of being a minister. And I had told him, do you remember the conversation we had at Ryan Camp's wedding shower? And he didn't, which tells you it really wasn't this big event. It wasn't even really a big event for me, but the conversation changed the entire course of my life. And all he said was, I think that you need to work for the church. I don't know what you're supposed to be doing, but I think that's where you belong. And I think you should look at going to school. That was it. Such a quiet, simple moment that changed a life completely, probably forever. I've had massive moments since then. Things that really should have shook the ground I walked on. Things that should have stuck with me and yet really don't have a very lasting impact on anything. I've had all kinds of opportunities to be a part of something grand and walked away from it and been less effective than some quiet 5-minute conversation with a friend. You don't have to be loud to be obedient. We're often the people that everyone pays attention to. Those of us with the loud, aggressive personalities, it's easy to pay attention to us. But don't think you have to adopt that personality to work for God's kingdom and to make a difference. Because it's usually the people that no one's paying attention to that make the most difference when it comes to God's kingdom. It's the people who sit down and just talk and take time to be a part of somebody's life. That's going to make the difference. Not some preacher getting up here and giving a really good lesson that I've taken months to prepare for you. The fact is, the amount of impact I have on you up here is really pretty limited. Something to consider. The idea of quiet submission oftentimes being the best course. Verse 19, the Nebuchadnezzar was filled with wrath, and his facial expression was altered toward Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And he answered by giving orders to heat the furnace 7 times more than it was usually heated. The furnace was designed to kill, right? That was the whole idea of putting you in the furnace, was that you died. Anyone overreacted ever before? You ever overreacted? When I was a kid, my foster dad that I lived with raced figure 8 races. And so he thought it would be a good teaching moment for me. I was like 8 when he started this. But he thought it would be a good teaching moment, teach me how to take care of a vehicle. It was always confusing for me because how do you teach somebody to take care of a vehicle by showing them how to destroy it? But there we are. So to prep a car for a figure 8 race, you have to change the tires out. right? Because you don't want good street tires on something you know is going to get wrecked. So you take those tires off, you put the bad tires on, you keep the good tires for your other vehicles. You have to take the windshield out, you have to take the car seats out, you put your roll bar in there. There's a lot of prep work that goes into it. My foster dad thought it would be a genius idea to buy an old retired police cruiser for a demo derby. And it was, except he gave me a sledgehammer and decided it was my job to get the windshield out. You ever seen what happens to a police cruiser's windshield when it gets hit? Nothing. I hit that windshield for about 20 minutes with a 5-pound sledgehammer and didn't make a single crack in it. And so my dad comes out there and he's yelling at me, right? Because this has to get done. The races are in 3 days and I haven't done anything all day. And I get so mad that I hurl this sledgehammer at him. I didn't hit him because I was 8 and I really wasn't that strong. But I remember the consequences of that action. That's a good way to put it. And one of the things he taught me in that moment was this. This was after the 20-minute blistering that I took for doing that. But he said, anytime you're going to overreact to a situation, understand that usually you're the one that's going to be hurt more by it than anyone else. And I think about that every time I read Daniel chapter 3, because we're reading about this king who designs a furnace specifically for the intention of putting live people in it and leaving them dead. And he gets so mad that he decides it needs to be 7 times hotter than it is required to kill a person. It seems kind of redundant, to be honest with you. So he heats up this furnace, and in verse 20, he commanded certain valiant warriors who were in his army to tie up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in order to cast them into the furnace of blazing fire. Now, I think there's a key point here. He says, valiant warriors. Not all people who serve in the military are called valiant. That's usually a very descriptive and honorific thing to call somebody. These weren't just an everyday soldier. These were people who had proven themselves in battle. And he orders them, you guys are the ones that are going to go put these people in this furnace, right? Taking no chances. There's no way these guys are going to get out of this. Then these men were tied up in their trousers, their coats, their caps, and their other clothes, and were cast into the midst of the furnace of blazing fire. For this reason, because the king's command was urgent, the furnace had been made extremely hot. The flame of the fire slew those men who carried up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. But these 3 men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell into the midst of the furnace of blazing fire, still tied up. You see why I bring up the story of me throwing a hammer at my dad, right? Because that thing that he told me rings true when we look at Nebuchadnezzar. He overreacts the situation, and as a result, not only does he not kill the people he's intending to kill, but he ends up losing brave warriors over it. It does nothing but hurt him. I think that there is a place and a time and a place for what we would call godly wrath. And that's not really quite the right word for it. Righteous anger is sometimes what we call it. The idea that I'm not angry over me being slighted. I'm angry because of a sin that you're committing and I want you to stop. I think there's a place for that. We see this with Jesus cleansing the temple, right? But we have to be very careful not to overreact when we feel that way. It's okay to be offended over a slight on behalf of God. I really do think that. It's okay to be upset when you see somebody damaging their relationship with the Father. But we have to be very careful about how we overreact to the situation. Why? Because People are inherently defensive. Right? We talked about this last week, that people are survivors. Not last week, it was 2 weeks ago. And the thing is when you overreact and attack somebody, you put them on the defensive. Now they're in a situation where they have to answer you, which allows them to bring up a whole myriad of excuses for why you're the one that's wrong and not me. You've done nothing to remedy the problem. Their relationship with God isn't repaired because of your outrage. Righteous anger is a motivator, not a tool. It should cause and motivate us to help correct a situation. But it's not meant for us to wield as a weapon. These three men, throughout all of this, are facing absolute certain death. They say something along those lines earlier. If you recall, they said to Nebuchadnezzar, "We believe that God can save us from the furnace and from your hands." And here's the wonderful thing. They also acknowledge that he's not obligated to. Right? Even if he does not, we will not do this. That can be a hard thing for us sometimes, right? The idea of asking God for something, I'm believing that he can and will do it, but also understanding and having it be a part of you that if he chooses not to, he's still your God. We see the same idea from Job, right? I believe it's chapter 34. Sam's probably going to correct me later on this. But I believe it's chapter 34 when Job says, "Even though he slay me, still I will believe in him." This is how a Christian ought to think. That can be tough. That can be tough because the world teaches us that if they wrong us, then they're against us, and that we have a right to defend ourselves. Right? And if you care about something, or if you care about somebody, you'll do whatever it takes to not see them hurt. That's the idea that the world gives us. And God gives us the idea hurt is a part of life, and it's going to hurt. And when you're done hurting, I'm going to be here. That's God. We have to be in a place where we can look forward to that. It's okay for us to pray to God to take our troubles away from us. It's okay for us to pray that God relieve the pain of whatever we're facing. Don't stop praying for those things. But be prepared for the no. Be prepared that God very well might not give you what you want, because you're not entitled to it. If I was more forethoughtful and actually did PowerPoints like some people have requested, I would have put up an image that most of you guys would recognize as a vending machine, because that's how we often approach God, right? Our faith in God and our baptism and our acceptance of his commandments and our Bible studies and our church attendance, those are all quarters, right? We keep putting them in the vending machine. And then when we decide we're thirsty, we should be able to hit that Pepsi button and get a cola, right? That's how it works. That's how most people see God, even if they don't realize that they see God that way. What we fail to realize is that all of those things that we think are quarters for us to turn in, that's the Pepsi God is giving to us for free. That's not something we give to God. That's something God has provided to us. Church isn't some way for you to serve God. Church is a way for God to serve you. And when we take that idea, it allows us to respond more reverently in church. Suddenly, worship takes on a whole new meaning. because no longer are we taking the attitude, well, God, here I am. I'm paying you this week, giving you my dues. When you start looking at congregating and fellowshipping with one another as a gift to you from God, suddenly there's joy to be found. Coming to church is no longer a burden or an obligation. It's this awesome gift that God has offered to you so that you can spend some time with people who understand. Because that's important, even if we don't realize it. We leave church and we go out into the world and people don't understand. They don't understand why we see the world the way we do. They don't understand why we respond to things the way we do. They don't understand the kind of relationships we have. Why are you so close to this person who has no relation to your family? How do I explain to them that this person who I met 2 years ago is a brother? How do you explain that to the world? You can't. They're never going to understand that concept. Not until they become a part of it. But on Wednesdays and Sundays, man, God has blessed me with the opportunity to come here and be surrounded by people for just a short amount of time who understand. I don't have to sit here and defend myself and explain every little thing I do. They get it. You understand the difference there? You're not doing a service for God by sitting in these pews. This is your gift, one of many. Don't allow your hearts to get to a place where you see this as some horrible duty and responsibility that you have to see through. It's in those moments that we find sickness coming through. When we start to suffer, when we start to feel disheartened. It all starts with the wrong mindset. That's what we're seeing with Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego. How easy would it have been for them to just obey the king if they had just for one time allowed themselves to say, God, I've been serving you, right? You sent me out to Babylon. I said, okay, let's go. I've done the best I can. I've done everything you've asked me to do. I've stood aside. I've retained my practices as a faithful Jew. God, this time right here, you need to look out for me. How easy would that have been? Not them. We're going to serve God. And if that means you're going to force us into a furnace, here we go. There's a part that we're going to get into here, and we're going to be done here in shortly, because this next part is really something that I want to take a little bit of time to extrapolate on and understand before we get into this. Right? This is one of those moments where we as Christians are allowed to not agree on everything. I'm going to lead with that in the hopes that if you disagree with me, you can show me some grace, okay? I'm going to rely on Sam probably, because he's going to correct some of my facts, I'm sure, because every preacher needs that guy in the audience, right? Theophany. Did I say that right, Sam? Theophany? This is a term that we use in religious studies for the idea of a pre-incarnation of Jesus Christ. The idea that Jesus was actually here before he was born. Okay? And this is what we're getting into the story, and there's a reason why I explain that, because if you disagree with me, the idea is hopefully you go and study it for yourself to decide whether I'm wrong or not, and you're going to come across that word. That's why I've defined it for you. So in verse 24, then Nebuchadnezzar the king was astounded and stood up in haste, and he responded and said to his high officials, was it not 3 men we cast bound into the midst of the fire. They answered and said to the king, Certainly, O king. He answered and said, Look, I see 4 men loosed and walking about in the midst of the fire without harm, and the appearance of the fourth is like a son of the gods. Ma'am, do you still have King James pulled open? Can you read that last part of 24 for us? 24. Says, then they answered, 25. Sorry. Okay. This ends up being a big hang up for a lot of people because we as Christians, we see those words, those 3 words, the Son of God, Son of God. And we say, Jesus, right? Because Jesus is the Son of God. And to be fair, a huge number of scholars have interpreted it quite exactly that way. This is a theophany. Jesus Christ made an appearance on earth to be in this situation, to serve these men, and then he was gone. This is before he was born. I don't necessarily agree with that. I shouldn't even say necessary. I don't agree with that. And I'm going to explain to you why I don't agree with that. I can't really explain to you that side of things because I don't see it that way. I don't really understand why people see it that way fully. But I can explain to you why I don't think this was Jesus. I think it was an angel. And my argument is this. We see between the King James and this is the NASB, but if you read the ESV and I think the NIV all have the same wording. Those words, when we go back to the Septuagint, the Greek version of the Old Testament, are actually plural. It's not son of God, it's sons of gods. Now, this is an important thing to understand because what did Nebuchadnezzar believe in? He's a polytheist. He didn't believe in Yahweh. He believed Yahweh existed, but he didn't believe he was the only God. Here's the point that I would make. If you don't know God, can you know Jesus? Can you accept Jesus as the Son of God if you don't even know God? So how would Nebuchadnezzar know that this figure in the furnace looks like Jesus if he had no idea who Jesus or God was? This isn't the only time that the phrase sons of gods appears in the Bible. We see it much earlier in the Old Testament when it talks about the sons of God intermingled with the daughters of man. And we certainly know that wasn't talking about Jesus. So that's my main thinking for why I don't believe that this is a theophany. I think that this is an angel of God sent down to serve God in this capacity, to save these men on behalf of God. Like I said, if you don't see it that way, if you disagree with me, that's fine. I'm okay with that. Go ahead, Dave. Sure. Sure. Yes. I agree that that's the main takeaway. The only reason I even bring this up is because this is a Bible study and this is something to consider about the text. It's the only reason it even should be brought up. But you're right. The main idea is that at the end of the day, even Nebuchadnezzar acknowledged who it was that saves these men. And we actually, so if we continue on in verse 26, then Nebuchadnezzar came near to the door of the furnace, a blazing fire. He responded and said, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, come out, you servants of the Most High God, and come here. Then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out of the midst of the fire. What a change in heart, right? He went from what God can deliver you from my hands to Please come here, servants of the Most High God. How much power does it have? How much power does it have when a child of God reacts in accordance with righteousness? These men didn't have to say a word. They didn't strike up a protest. They didn't put up a picket line. They didn't write a letter to their governor. They didn't get their elders to go out and speak to them. They just obeyed. And look at the reaction that it has. The most powerful man in the world is humbled, recognizing God's power. There again is that idea of quiet obedience, quiet submission. Now, we also know in hindsight, anyone who's read through Daniel, that this too is not really going to last very long with Nebuchadnezzar. But in this moment, he at least recognizes God's power. And the satraps, this is verse 27, and the satraps, the prefects, the governors, and the king's high officials gathered around and saw in regard to these men that the fire had no effect on the bodies of these men, nor was the hair of their head singed, nor were their trousers damaged, nor had the smell of fire even come upon them. Nebuchadnezzar responded and said, Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and delivered his servants who put their trust in him, violating the king's command, and yielded up their bodies so as not to serve or worship any god except their own God. Therefore I make a decree that any people, nation, or tongue that speaks anything offensive against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be torn limb from limb, and their houses reduced to a rubbish heap, inasmuch as there is no other God who is able to deliver in this way. And the king caused Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to prosper in the province of Babylon. Now, I want to end on this verse 27, the idea that we're given in there, because when God does something, he really doesn't do a good job or a decent job. We have a line that I got from my grandfather and found out there's a great many people who use this, and I came across it a lot working, on the floors with blue-collar workers as we were. Good enough for government work. Use it all the time. It may not be up to spec, but it's better than what the government would have done. Good enough for government work. It was an excuse for us to pass subpar work. That's all it was. It was an excuse for us to not do the best that we could. Mostly it was an excuse because we really didn't want to take that part and throw it away and do it again. God doesn't ever have that idea. Good enough for government work. Everything God does is absolute, complete, and perfect. Look at these men, right? It would have been, we would have believed, and Nebuchadnezzar would have believed just because they lived through this. But God wasn't sufficient with just good enough. And he protects them so fully, so wholly, that when they leave the fire, there's not even an evidence that they ever went in. That's pretty powerful stuff. And we understand that if he could have kept them alive, that it's probably not that much more of a leap, but it shows you God's character. It's not about questioning whether he's powerful enough to do this or this. It's about his character. God does the best all the time. Something for us to consider for ourselves when we're talking about how we're children of God, we're followers of Christ, who is part of God's Trinity. How often do you say that to yourself? It's good enough for government work. I showed up. I came in and I told him I would clean, and I did pretty good. It's good enough. I made a commitment to this person to help them move, and I came in and I lifted up a box and I moved it across the hall. I did good enough. The song leader who picks his songs 5 minutes before service on Sunday morning doesn't really know them to the best of his abilities because it's good enough. Somebody who leads a Bible study and gives himself 2 hours to actually study through it because nobody else is doing it, so it's good enough. How can we continue to call ourselves followers of the Most High God? How can we consider ourselves His children and His servants if we can't even reflect the most evident part of His character? Are you going to be able to do stuff perfectly? Never. I've never seen anyone do anything perfectly, ever. Except for that sentence that I just said. That was perfect. But being children of God means having our feet pointed in the right direction. And just as importantly, it means we are walking. There's a lot of us that have our feet pointed exactly where they're supposed to be pointed and are content to sit there and look. If you're not walking, it doesn't really matter where you're looking. My point is this. No one, and I mean not even God, expects you to be at perfection. But I think it is very evident that if you are going to try to reflect the character of God the best you can, it means that that's something you're working towards. It means that that's on your mind and on your hearts, that when you do this job, you're going to do the best you can, because if God did it, He was going to do the best He could. And that's who we are. It's things like this that give us the idea of people seeing God through the way we live. How many of you worked a job where you worked with a person? How many of you worked a job where you worked with a person that didn't work with you? Yeah, love those lazy workers, right? I'm not even going to ask how many times we've been the lazy worker. If I'm being honest, that number's probably more than the other, at least for me. When you're in a work environment and you're just doing good enough, right? Say you're working food, right? Work at Burger King, McDonald's, Hardee's, they're all the same kind of restaurants, right? You get the sandwiches out the window, you get the food made according to the order, it's good enough. How many people look at you, though, when you're not just getting the orders out, but the food is actually presentable? I don't know if you've ever ordered a McRib from McDonald's. You know, they come out like once a year. I love those sandwiches. I do. I eat them every time they come out. I make sure I stop and get some. Here's the thing. I also have to take 20 minutes to rebuild the sandwich when I open it up. Because very rarely do you get one of those and the onions are actually on the meat. I've opened them up and had the meat on the cardboard and the bun on top and some onions in the bag. My point is this. It seems like such a small thing in the time. It's just a small thing. It's not a big deal, right? It's more important that I get it done. But when you watch somebody make a sandwich on that line next to you, and you're seeing them and they're actually doing it the way it's supposed to be done, and there's not a bunch of trash in the box around it when they're done, boy, it makes you second guess what you're doing with your life. Or maybe Maybe you work on a production line and you're building something, and the guy next to you is building the same thing. And you're getting it done, you're following the directions, but you're just kind of slapping it together. It's very clear you don't care about your work, and that's an important part, because even if your results look the same, the way you went about it also tells people how much you care. You could tell the difference between somebody who builds something with his hands and truly cares about what he's doing, and somebody who builds something with his hands because he needs to get a paycheck and that's all he cares about. But here's the thing, when you're the person working next to that guy who shows how much he cares that his work is something worthwhile, it reflects. And most importantly, it usually drives us to do the same. That's really where I'm getting with all of this. But everything we do the best to our abilities, because that's the character that we see from God, and because it urges other people to do the same. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego put their lives on the line repeatedly. Nobody's calling you to do that. Maybe one day, but not right now. We just ask that you come, love people, love God, and find ways to serve Him. Compare that with what they're willing to do, and it doesn't seem like such a big ask, does it? Daniel 3 is, there's a lot of lessons that we can pull from Daniel 3. But I think that the main thing that we need to remember, right, if you've been blanking me out this whole time, right, and you just need me to tell you in 5 seconds or less, is this: God cares about those who are willing to stand for Him. And He's not demanding that you do it loud from a mountaintop. Obedience does not require sound all the time. It's okay to be a patient, quiet person. And most of the time, being that person, you're going to make more differences than somebody like I will. Something for you to consider. Please join me as we approach the throne of God together. Dear Father, we love you. And we thank you for the power that you show us, for the character that you present to us, and for the calling that comes from that. We thank you for the lives that you've blessed us with, the opportunities that have been presented to us, and also for making us prepared, able to perform those works that you've set aside. Lord, sometimes we struggle. We can sometimes struggle with that quiet obedience. Sometimes we can struggle with making excuses for ourselves on why we fall short. We ask that you help us with this. Purify our hearts. Bless our minds against those whispers of deceit. So that as we leave here, we go out into the world to show people the glory that you have shown to us, we may do so in a way that pleases you, in a way that truly reflects the Master who has given us all. It's through your Son, Jesus, who was and is Christ our Lord and Savior, that we pray these things. Amen.